Preparing to stream live video right now. It's connecting over. It is connecting over. Come on, connect over.
Yeah, meeting is now streaming live on YouTube.
Copy. Paste that into there. There you go. You're good. Go ahead.
Are we good? Welcome everybody to the very first in the absolute. I'm so excited to bring this workshop series to you. This tonight is all about kids and anxiety, and I am just so honored to be here and that you would pull up a chair and sit with all of us tonight. So we're going to jump right in. I have so much content that we're going to try to jam into this 60 minutes, and then there's going to be questions. If you're watching the replay, obviously you can't watch or you can't ask the live questions, but we're going to leave the question and answer period up there, and we'll have 30 minutes to answer questions. And so of course it's 6:30 Mountain Time here, and you can expect to hang out with me for the next 90 minutes or so. So I can see your comments. We've got Dale in the room and Stacy in the room. Des is behind the scenes. So I'm watching all of your comments coming in, and so if you have any questions or anything you need me to know about as I'm talking, I'd love to see it and hear it, and connecting with other people on the platform too is really fantastic. This is sort of this platform is one that we absolutely love because it really allows everybody to connect with each other. So a disclaimer before we begin. Tonight, of course, I'm Dr. Jody Carrington. I am a clinical psychologist, but everything that we talk about tonight is meant for information purposes only. It's not intended or considered therapy. And I would really encourage you throughout tonight, I put some resources that you'll see on the site, some links to 3 different handouts and places to follow up after. And if you have any concerns about your child or anybody in your life who might need a clinical diagnosis, of course, seeking professional consultation or that of your physician is always recommended. The reason for this workshop series for me is really just to create some resources for people in what I think is a mental health crisis. I think there's a lot of people struggling with very big emotions and not understanding exactly what it means. And anxiety is a word we hear all the time. So just prior to before we step in, I want to tell you that everything I'm creating and sharing with you tonight, I developed here on Treaty 7 territory, which is also now known as the province of Alberta, the central part of Alberta. And it is home of the Blackfoot Confederacy. It is made up of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3. It is my honor and my privilege to raise my babies here, to be able to share this information with you here tonight. And it is something that we at Team Jody take very, very seriously in our ongoing commitment to reconciliation. So with that, let's jump in. I have so much stuff to tell you. Okay. I want to tell you a little bit about this word anxiety because I think it is the thing that I hear about the most. And I worked, for those of you that don't know my background, I worked at the Alberta Children's Hospital for 10 years on a locked psychiatric inpatient unit for kids. I have since spent a lot of time in the world of trauma integrated practice and relationship focused therapy. I have a small practice here in Old Alberta, Canada, and I do a lot of speaking around the globe. I've written 3 nationally best-selling books, one for parents and teachers called Kids These Days, and another one called Teachers These Days. So I really love to talk about anxiety and how it's developed. And so what we're going to do tonight is sort of walk through a bit of a trajectory process. I'm going to talk a little bit about what anxiety is. I want to tell you a little bit about the neurophysiology behind it. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the symptom presentation. And then there's a back, some handouts for you in that way. And then really, I want to tell you a little bit more about the anxiety diagnostic process. And then some tips for how we help our kids and the people we love through this process. Now, when we first started thinking about setting up, doing this workshop series, we were like, let's do a workshop series for anxiety with little babes and anxiety for big people. And I think that the process is all the same, regardless of age, race, religion, socioeconomic status, gender identity, ability. I think there's an underlying neurophysiological process that I'd really like to just start with tonight, because anxiety is defined as a feeling of nervousness, unease, typically when something's about to happen. And here's what you need to know more than anything. It's normal. Everybody should have anxiety. It is an indicator that something, an experience, an event is new to the system. Okay. So I think what is so critical when we start to talk about, I can see some of your comments tonight on, test anxiety, or starting a new class, or being in a new place, or, moving to university, or, separating, going for this first sleepover. There should be, it's normal to have some anxiety in new situations are high stress situations. Okay. So let's clarify that first, and I'll explain why it's normal. Second, it's not dangerous. Even though severe anxiety feels like it will kill you in the moment, typically it won't. It is an emotion. Not talking about emotions is the thing, as a psychologist, I often say is the most important part. So if you know that the kids that you love or you care for are presenting with symptoms, oftentimes that's the best indicator that then we know we have something to work with. So what I think is really interesting about anxiety is that it itself, although it can feel extremely overwhelming sometimes, it's an emotion. And we got to figure out a little bit more about why it's there, why the body is in a state of heightened arousal. And once we sort of can get explanations for that, put it into context, regulate the system, oftentimes it's so much easier to hang on to it. And three, I think the other point I want to mention right out of the gate is it's adaptive. The reason that it's there is to indicate for us that there's something new, exciting, scary, that there's something we should be concerned about maybe in our environment. And so just noticing why the body's responding in that way is often one of the most critical pieces to then be able to regulate the system. Okay. Now, some of the data around this is really interesting to me because, part of the things that I worry about the most these days, I think, is the rapid increase in the experience of anxiety generally around the globe. And so there's multiple estimations around the data. And I think, any reputable Google search would sort of talk a lot about, it's hard to measure because reporting differs, but it occurs in 5 to 18% of children and adolescents. I mean, that's one study. When we were thinking, when I was researching a little bit about, relevant Canadian data, it looks like, 39% of all kids will discuss or meet criteria for a clinical anxiety disorder at some point in their life. It's very different between the symptom presentation between boys and girls, and so, or males and females. So 2 to 1. When we go through, there's equal prevalence among young boys and girls until adolescence. And then girls jump up 3 to 1, females versus males. And I think there's lots of reasons for that we're going to talk about today. I think what is so critical about this, again, is really normalizing this experience, because I'll tell you why anxiety is adaptive. First of all, if you've read kids these days, if you've chatted about, if you've heard me speak before, I'm going to just go through the sort of neurophysiological underpinnings. And so if you've seen me do this before, this is the stuff that I love from Dan Siegel, who is a psychiatrist, has written a number of amazing things that sort of help me understand the lid flip. But I'm going to show you this real quick, okay? So put your hands up with me like this. Put your thumb on the inside and wrap your fingers around your thumb. Follow along with me. And I think that this right now is the hand model of your brain, okay? So it's currently about the size of the brain that sits in your skull in this moment. And if we were to figure it out, or if I were to put it anatomically in your body, it would fit like this, okay? So your arm represents your spinal cord. Your wrist is your brain stem. Now flip your fingers up. Okay, this is now the inside of your brain. Your thumb represents your limbic system. Okay, this is where fight, flight, and freeze lives. And Everybody, humans and some mammals, develop from the inside out. This is the most primitive part of your brain right here, represented by your thumb. That is where the emotional regulation centers of the brain lives. Fight, flight, and freeze live on the inside of your brain. What separates humans from all other mammals is we have a prefrontal cortex that wraps around the limbic system. It lives right above your eyes, okay? In there, everything you've ever learned in your life, like how to regulate emotion, how to use your words, how to be kind, that all lives in that prefrontal cortex right up here. Now, Dan Siegel says when your lid is on, you have access to all of those things you've learned, your strategies to control anxiety, your ability to use your words or talk about what might be wrong. When Dan says, if you've ever heard this term, she's flipped her lid, lost her friggin' mind. What we're talking about is when we get emotionally distressed, we flip everything we need to know out of the way, and we have access only to fight, flight, and freeze. Now, here's what's interesting about emotional regulation. You are at your best and calm when you are emotionally regulated. Your lid is on, okay? One of the biggest keys of parenting, of teaching, of coaching, of mentoring is to walk little people and big people, but we're talking about, little people, teens, adolescents, young adults tonight, through big emotion. And the more time we have people in our world that can regulate us in this process, the more we start to develop neural pathways that allow us to stay calm in times of distress, okay? When you bring a baby home from the hospital, how do they let you know what they need? They cry. They flip their lid because they don't have a lot of skills. They don't have words to say, I'm hungry, I'm sad, I'm hurt. So they flip their lid, and our job is to walk them home. It's this Ram Dass quote that if you've ever heard me speak before, it hangs right over my shoulder in my office here. Ram Dass said this: we are all just here walking each other home. And I love that, because that is the job of big people. That is the job of educators, oftentimes, or coaches, aunts, cookums, mushums, to be able to navigate big emotion in kids is to be able to soothe them in this process, to walk them through it, okay? And here's what's also really adaptive about this process of emotional dysregulation is that there's many times in our life that we actually need access to fight, flight, or freeze. We don't need to know everything we've ever learned in our lives, right? If you're out, I often talk that, if you're out frolicking in the woods, okay? If you're out frolicking and you are enjoying your time, you're using your words, you're maybe, spending time with your children or a loved one, and your lid is on, you're laughing, which tells me your lid is on, okay? Because when we're emotionally regulated, we have access to our words, and we're, joy is present. We have the ability to hang on to those things. When I see something that scares the ever-loving Jesus out of me, like a cougar or a bear jumps out, I don't want to have access to everything I've ever learned. I don't want to know my PIN number then. I don't want to know how to judge a heifer. I don't want to have access to, shoot, what kind of cougar is that? Looks like a very large cat. Irrelevant. My body goes into fight, flight, or freeze, and it says, ha! Get everything out of the way so that all the blood can rush to the core of my body, that I can move fast. Suddenly, usually for about 22 seconds, we have sometimes enormous amounts of strength, agility, speed. All of those things are intended and very much neurophysiologically wired to keep us safe enough to get out of the way to get to safety. Okay, so we flip that lid, and that's a necessary piece. And our body, which is so cool, does this automatically. When we don't have access to other people sort of in that moment, we have the ability to sort of do this like that. We get out of the way and we get ourselves to safety, or we, fight back. And generally speaking, when, we're being attacked by a cougar or a bear, or any of those things, you want to be able to act fast. This is also true, I often talk about, when you come upon a scene of an accident, or as an adult, when you see that your child is hurt. Oftentimes what we do is we don't need to slow down long enough to wildly assess the situation. We flip it out of the way, and we move, we do our best. And sometimes we reflect on, experiences and go how did I do that? wow, like I don't even remember that, the moments, or I remember very specific moments of those things, because when we flip our lid out of the way, sort of we lose access to so many of the specific details because we don't need access to those in that moment. Okay. When we are in this state, and so you can imagine when we bring kids home from the hospital, when kids are young, 0 to 2, right, there's not a lot of resources there to keep the lid on, so there's a lot of flipping. Okay. We also learn quite quickly that we are then dependent on big people to be able to do the navigating for us, right? So some of the very initial anxieties or worries or things that sort of get us uptight is when we notice that our attachment figures, the people who can walk us through those big emotions, become unavailable. So separation at bedtime, when we go to school for the first time, when we want to, get in an uneasy situation, is that a stranger? I don't know the script for what to do here. This is my first sleepover. And I'm all fine when, it's late outside and we're playing and my lid is on. But then when the lid flips, or when it gets dark outside and I have to lay in bed and I start to think about all the things that could go wrong, my lid starts to come off a little bit and I lose access to my resources, and fight or flight sort of kicks in to place. And so what I want you to think about in terms of, because this is going to be when we start to talk about the strategies, how we sort of get back to the process of walking our kids through big things. So much of the answer when we're speaking about anxiety is to be able to regulate the system again and get back to what we know to be true. Because what we tend to do is lose access to those things, particularly when we get scared. And we just have to start to be able to assess, either help our kids through that or give them the skills to kind of assess the situation around them, to know whether they should be in a state of lid flip in that moment. Is it necessary to keep them safe? Is the body reacting to something that once we put into context, we can put it back into place? Okay. Now, I'm going to walk through some of the behaviors that we see sometimes that can sort of mimic anxiety, because it would be super friggin' helpful is if anxiety really just looked like anxiety. If your kid could say to you, I'm anxious, it would be super helpful. This is anxiety. Dad, this is what anxiety looks like. Then we would know. So part of the hardest part, one of the things that is interesting to me and the most about this process is that there are all kinds of behaviors. I want you to think, there's been so many great pictorial representations of this, but sort of the iceberg, or you just see the piece that's sticking out on top. You don't see all the pieces that's driving it underneath, or just how big it is underneath, or a duck underwater. A duck looks so great, but if you would ever look under the water, it's like the feet are doing like this. And that's kind of sometimes for kids what anxiety can look like. So I want to give you some behaviors, and this is true of any age, okay? But oftentimes when we're looking at our kids, this is the interesting piece. So anger, in one of the handouts that I gave you, I unloaded sort of 2 different things. So things that sort of like, it looks like, I think it's the first handout, anxiety symptom presentations. It can show up on the surface and then the feelings underneath are represented. So if we think about some of the things that we look for, that we hear about sometimes, is anger. Chandeliering is a term that Brene Brown used that really just meant like, all of a sudden it's like a snap. So you can imagine, you're trying to hold it together, hold it together, hold it together, hold it together, hold it together. You're doing your strategies, you're doing all those things. And then there's just one more thing that sends it over and you're like, ah. Okay. So sometimes that when we're in a heightened state of arousal, it's really hard to sort of keep it together. You can imagine that when you are either sort of developmentally in a place where it's hard to keep that lid on, you shouldn't keep the lid on because you're scared about things. When you are uncertain about something, when you are scared of something, when you're not sure of a plan about something, all of those things tend to be something that flips our lid, that gets that a little bit shaky. And what happens, when you see kids that are safe and secure and in predictable places, it's easier to keep your lid on, like you and me, right? It's easier to keep our lid on when things are safe and predictable and we know what to do. We have a script for things. When we start to sort of get in that place where we don't have a script, this is normal. It's supposed to look a little shaky. right? And so sometimes our best response to that then is, how do we build in either systems or people or strategies or communities that can walk us through this? Here's the issue. The chaos, the flipping is necessary to learn how to get it back on. I'll say that one more time. The chaos is necessary to learn the calm. Because when you are, there's two very different skills here. When your lid is on and I practice all the things I'm going to do to keep you safe, which we'll talk, or not keep you safe, to keep you regulated, which we'll talk about in a minute. For example, things like breathing, using your words, taking a drink of water, journaling, blowing out your not losing your friggin' mind. When my lid is on, I'm regulated. I can have access to all of those things, just like a parent. I'm a fantastic friggin' parent when my lid is on. I wrote a best-selling book called Kids These Days. If you watch me with my own personal children on most given days, you wouldn't buy the book. Okay? Because I wrote it when my lid is on. I have access to all of those things. But I will tell you, there's been many times, calls in the middle of the night. You can ask my mom and my mother-in-law, where I have been like, Asher's not sleeping. He's scared that, the world is going to blow up. Or, Evan in particular had lots of questions about, is people real? Are we all just fake? What's happening in the universe? Are you going to die? Is everybody going to die? When we start to get anxious, we lose access to the best parts of ourselves, what we know to be true, okay? Our skills. This is true of us big people, okay? So if you were to call me in a time where you were really worried about your babe, I would be like, okay, let's talk through it. And we would be able to get back to the things that we know to be true. What is most distressing for most of us, most lid flippable for most of us, is when our kids are flipping their lids. When our kids look like they are not regulated. Because what do we want for our kids? If I were to ask anybody this at any time, they're like, I just want them to be happy. Right? We like it best in this society when kids are regulated. When people are, we like it best when our partners are emotionally regulated, right? And I often say we come from this generation where we've been very raised to believe that it is best when kids are calm. You finish the sentence. Kids should be seen and not heard. I could hear you saying that. And so we don't like it when everybody's losing their minds. Because of course we love our babies and we want them to be regulated and safe and secure and know that their life is predictable and all of those things. But here's what I want to tell you so clearly. The chaos is necessary to learn the calm. So I can give you all the strategies and skills. You can practice them with your children. One of the most important situations when we are developing skills around regulating emotion, particularly in anxiety-provoking situations, is to be able to understand that those surrounding the child become really, really critical in walking them through that process. Okay? Or the university student, or the adolescent or the teen. And oftentimes, this is the other trick, the older they become, they don't like their parents to be the walkers necessarily. They're much more responsive to their best friend's mom or to their auntie or their grandma than they are to their primary caregiver sometimes. And that's normal too. That's okay. And so we often feel so debilitated by the fact that, we're not the ones that can help our babies through these things, which is, first of all, second of all, or third of all, or how many of alls we're on. Normal. Okay. So let's just, with that preface in place, I want to talk about some of the things that, when you're anxious or I'm anxious, when our children are anxious, it doesn't just come out as, this is an anxiety behavior, Mom. This is what I look like when I'm anxious. Here's some things that can also be representative of anxiety, things like anger. Okay, big explosive emotion, sleep issues, nightmares, co-sleeping requests. When you wake up in the middle of the night and you start to spin on things or worry about things or navigate things, particularly at night when you are alone with your thoughts, think about this. You have very little regulating others, very little distraction, very little things, very little opportunity for things that can kind of get that prefrontal cortex back on. Okay. So oftentimes nighttime fears are a big deal for kids. And it makes sense because I have a lot of time to start to think about things or process my day. Or if I wake up in the middle of the night and have just had a scary dream, if I, sometimes have had a really bad experience at school or at a sleepover or whatever the case may be, sometimes that feeling in my body comes back when everything else in the world gets quiet. You also can then appreciate that sometimes what we'll see is over planning, wanting to know everything, every detail, avoidance of things. I'm not sure, uncertainty, fear, no end in sight. That's the big kickers for emotional dysregulation. So oftentimes we'll see, trying to prep for those things. Irritability, like tantrums, meltdowns, when somebody's exhausted and tired, all of those things sort of come into place. Negativity in and of itself, of course, anything in and of itself isn't one predictor, but you can imagine when you're in a heightened state, all of these things become a little bit more difficult to manage. Difficulty separating or being, a desire to be closest to people that are close to people that are you regulating others, also something that happens so frequently. The other thing sometimes, particularly with little kids, when they can't say I'm worried or I'm scared, when bigger kids, can kind of say I want to come back, or can you stay in my bed till I fall asleep? Any of those kind of questions. Sometimes it manifests into somatic complaints like tummy aches, stomach aches, headaches, nausea. I feel like I'm going to be sick all the time. Our oldest would often be in the infirmary, or the sick room, infirmary. Do we still call that? What is this, 1972? At the school, you would be like, I'm going to be ill. And of course, like, not a popular deal when COVID is hot and heavy, when people are like, so there's a common experience, when your body feels in this heightened state. What happens, as we talked about from this neurophysiological perspective, particularly when you've just seen a bear, your blood rushes, your systems start to slow down in terms of digestion, your heart rate increases, sometimes your palms get sweaty, sometimes your face and your head get sweaty, all of the things that would indicate either you're having a heart attack or you're ill. So that's the anxiety is such a bitch like this, you see, because it really looks like so many things. And it is so interesting to recognize the patterns. Sometimes when we start to notice right away about, does this happen on particular days or on particular transitions from, one house to the other, when there is uncertainty, fear, no end in sight, when there's a certain class, the big game, sleepovers, times with, separating from mom or dad, it doesn't mean that these are bad things. It certainly indicates that it's a transition. And the body sort of puts us into this state, and there's all of these behaviors that start to come to the surface that makes us chippy, irritable, and then questioning everything. Are you safe? Am I going to die? Is Jesus real? What's happening to the world? I think we're all going to die. I heard this on the news today. And so when you're in that heightened state, when you consume information, you pay attention to the things that could be threatening, right? And this is adaptive. Of course, if the truth is you're really going to die, you want to tune in to the radio and be like, did you hear that? There's a war, and there's this, and there's that, and there's all of those other things. Because we lose our filter to be able to regulate and make sense of things. And, I'm anxious because, or my heart is racing because I just heard this. My heart is racing because my palms are sweating, my knees are weak. I mean, people have written songs about this. I mean, it could mean you're falling in love. It could mean you're at a scary movie. It could mean, but depending on how we interpret those messages, but how we put it into context, it can either further exacerbate it or reconcile some of those symptoms and regulate. Okay. So sometimes the behaviors on the surface are really propelled by lots of things underneath. And I think sometimes this is the thing that I think is really critical to remember so often. All behavior has meaning. And how we interpret that behavior is really the answer. If I interpret your behavior, you come through the door, slam it, and say, your 13-year-old comes through the door. At the end of the day, Now, he is chippy. There is a door slamming, there's a request for food, or there's a straight to the bedroom slam of the door, right? There's lots of things happening in that particular body. And when we have, he comes through the door and says, "What's for supper around here?" What's interesting to me about that is what happens to our lid. Excuse me, what's for supper? Back it up. We don't slam the door. Put your shoes where they're supposed to be. What is wrong with you? And in your head, you're like, oh my God, he's going to jail. He got drunk Uncle Mark's jeans. That's what's wrong with him. Oh my. We lose access to the best parts of ourselves because you know what? The truth is, your kid usually doesn't come through the door slamming it and demanding things. Well, and how we measure this, right, is let's say your best friend's kid came through the door, right? You and I are friends and you said, "Hey, I'm just wondering if, Jack can come to your house after school today. I'm not going to be able to get him to practice on time. My gosh, can you do me a favor?" I'd be like, absolutely. I mean, Jack's amazing, obviously. So he comes through the door, slams it, says those things to me. What is your response to your best friend's kid? I'm going to say, "Hey, buddy, I got lots of things for supper. What do you need? What are you thinking about?" Because I have the best access to myself, right? I know that something's going on here, right? Can I get you a snack? What happened? What's interesting then is sometimes we start to unpack what might be underneath that. And underneath that sometimes are things like embarrassment or feeling ashamed about something, uncertainty, jealousy, disrespect. They felt disrespected or hurt, insecure, grief, regret, overwhelmed, frustrated. All of those things are emotions that can feed it. And, I often say this, the story is a prerequisite to empathy. The situation, the understanding of how we got there allows us often to get to a place of understanding. You are not going to get the context or the story, if they don't have words, right? If they are emotionally dysregulated or they don't have access to the words. And so what becomes a first order of practice most of the time is the regulating of emotion, is a putting that lid back on. Okay, does that make sense? I'm watching your comments. It's the reintegration of that prefrontal cortex. That is the step we often miss because we tend to try to want to fix it or solve it or make suggestions. And when your lid is flipped and somebody says, "Use your words, do your breathing, take a deep..." First and foremost, it's about getting this regulated first, right? How much do we engage in the worries? How many conversations do we have about this process? How do we go again and again and again, around those things? And so what I want to just sort of separate right now, I think, is a developmental process that I think is really interesting. I added another handout to just sort of some of the developmental presentations that change over time. For kids, because you can imagine, the more skill you have, the bigger your brain is, the more sort of ways you have to express when your body doesn't feel just right. Okay. And what I think is interesting about that are, if I think about young kids, sometimes you're looking for patterns and things like frequent tantrums. When uncertainty, fear, no end in sight is sort of happening around us, that is kind of a bit of a, I think, a prerequisite for things like irritability and tantrums. If I don't know what's going on, if I'm on my way to the airport and I don't have this and I forgot my passport and I don't know what the plan is here and why is this flight delayed, and you know what, you can go, it's canceled. I'm going to have a tantrum because my resources, everything I have access to, right, is uncertain. I'm scared and there's no end in sight, which means I'm going to be a little bit flippy, a little bit, it's going to be much more difficult for me to stay connected. The other thing that I think is really critical is the somatic stuff starts to happen. Your body, from a physiological perspective, starts to shut down. And this is so true for kids. Tummy aches, headaches. I don't know what's going on, but something doesn't feel right here. So somatic complaints sometimes are a number one kicker. nighttime, sleeping and, wanting to sort of, crawl into your bed again. So much of this stuff is normal because when do the biggest worries come? Well, sometimes when I'm a little brain trying to process a whole bunch of things happens. This is very true about when we hit adolescence, right? But we're going to get there for a second. Lots of questions about death, life, relationships. So common in this sort of early part of life, you know, zero, well, once you get words 2 to 10, right? Is daddy gonna be okay? Are you gonna be okay? It's very hard. The division of loyalty is really hard. So if you are raising your babies in 2 separate households or even 3 separate households, the division of loyalty also becomes really hard to navigate. So when I have to be away from daddy, or if I'm spending a weekend at mom's, or if daddy's traveling for work or mommy's traveling for work or whatever the deal is, it is the unpredictability of that that can sometimes lead to a disruption in the ability to stay regulated, right? And so many times there is so much about that. Tina, I see your question about what do we do for bedtime anxiety. I'm going to get there for a second. So the questions, the uncertainty, the big questions of the world, which I'm exhausted by usually. The more you see kids that have when there's access to sort of information or big conversations or questions. That's what I want the brain to be doing, figuring out these things, having somewhere to put it or talk through it or sort it out. And it can be scary and exhausting when we don't have places to sort of put those emotions. I'll take you into sort of the, pre-adolescent, adolescent phases. Insert hormones, right? Insert access to bigger worries. Insert now these days inundation of social media and YouTube and things that, are also sometimes our brains weren't made to develop, which means now these days more than ever, it's so critically important to check in with, ask questions about, have conversations about, because when we have nowhere to put that, we are sometimes scared to ask those questions. We are sometimes scared to sort of bring it up, but it's okay to sort of wonder about things with kids, particularly if death or dying is a thing, if they've had an experience with death, are you worried about, tell me more, what's the hardest part, all of those things. And it's very difficult to make a promise, particularly if, they've lost somebody or, there's no certainty in this process, so it's very much around the assurances like, you will always have so many people who love you. And, tonight, you and me, we are here. Everything is safe. How do we sort of regulate back to that part of the brain as much as we possibly can? That's really critical. When we get into that pre-adolescent, adolescent phase, again, it is that think about when you get overly worried about anything, whether it's in the clinical place or not, school refusal, defiance, work refusal, avoidance of things. Sometimes those physical symptoms can get bigger, like nausea, vomiting, again, bedtime, early morning. Some of those are very common times. And we don't like those feelings, so we want to escape from them. And interesting things like cutting in teenagers, often cutting, I can just define as, making marks in the skin, oftentimes it's on the wrist or on the legs. Is meant to be a distraction from this feeling that is anxiety or worry or fear, and is often not indicative of suicidal intention or ideation. It is much more of a numbing in an attempt to get away from big emotions. And oftentimes it makes sense to us, substance use or attempting to sort of drop that heightened state, particularly, when there is social inhibitions or when you sort of make choices where you don't have a lot of forward thinking into that process, and we have access to things that sort of make it difficult to sort of stay calm in times of distress. The accessibility to some of those things are then, okay, how do we sort of navigate our kids in this place and be their external resources while we're navigating their steps into independence? It's a tricky time. I'm telling you, it's a tricky time. young adult, I would talk about if you got a baby who is, headed to college or university, or, stepping out into, the later stages of high school. Um, what happens in those places, right, is that, we'll see a preoccupation with others' impressions of them. I mean, this is so true. I'm early and earlier these days because there's so much access to others' responses, to us as adults, but certainly to our kids, avoiding social interactions like, just not going to school, skipping school, work. Job responsibilities can sometimes be indicative of this, excessive numbing with substances. And so this is where we see, sometimes daily use or increased uses of substances. One of my favorite guys, that works in this process, I talk a lot about this in Feeling Seen, is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection, because so much of the time what we're doing is trying to control the bigness of emotion, right? Again, cutting and significant sleep disruptions, as we sort of move through that trajectory of little guys to big guys. And what I think is really critical in this process, right, is just sort of understanding that some of these things are not meant to be sort of behavioral slaps to the face about, I don't want to do these things. But I think what I'd like to just sort of talk a little bit about is the trajectory that is so normal. And, it's interesting, there are some kids that are just more introverted than others. And if I look at it as a trajectory, when anxiety gets into a clinical disorder, it becomes debilitating in your daily functioning. Okay. When we think about it as a spectrum, I mean, there's kids that are introverted. There are kids that, it's a personality trait. They, prefer low stimulating settings. They are, maybe sensitive, and, really responsive to sounds and touch and, even textures on clothes. Prefer small groups or individual sports. I mean, sometimes that's how some kids are wired. That's okay. If we think about shyness, if I think about just introversion, introverted sort of kids who are just a little bit less big than other kids, if I think about shyness as a trait, there's often, I just don't want to put myself out there, negative social judgment, lacks maybe some confidence at, various things, that tests they haven't gained access to, and very much prefer being around people that they love and they know. Also, not a clinical diagnosis. This is, something that they struggle with. When we move into this place of, it becoming a disorder, I think that there's a big range in there that we have to be really clear about, because anxiety as an indicator of a new situation, something that I'm worried about, losing some sleep sometimes over things, that's normal. Worrying about what people think about you, there's a normalness to those things. The TSN turning point, the thing that I often think about is, for an extended period of time, does it start to significantly disrupt functioning? And when it starts to do those things, are we aware of some of the strategies that we're going to talk about a little bit to sort of regulate the system, to be able to sort of push through or navigate or, work through some of these big stories, these big emotions? Okay. And I think, I think that, the diagnosis around some of these things, if I think about a DSM, from a clinical perspective, there's all different sort of subtypes of anxiety, social anxiety disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. We have to try to think about, generalized anxiety disorder is really being identified as, it's in a clinically significant state, and there's excessive worry about performance, competence at school, sporting events, about personal safety of other family members, or about natural disaster, future events. It is a big worry about most everything. Social anxiety disorder is tending to be really a little bit more specific, to overwhelming, like fear of humiliation, and social situations cause high stress and kind of debilitating. You don't go, I don't want to be there. Again, I think what is so critically important about this is that it is a spectrum, right? And that there'll be some times that when there's a refusal or a notice, we just want to know that that is data to suggest that sometimes it might be difficult to step into those things, and some of that is normal. What I want to then just talk about now, which is, I see everybody asking these questions, and what in the name of Jesus do we do about it? Okay, so that was as much information as I can give you in the first 45 minutes, very quickly, about sort of how the whole thing manifests. And here is the coming home about what you do about it. Yeah. I think we added are we doing okay? Oh, thank you. What do we do about this now? I will tell you, when people come to me or when we have consultations or worries about kids who are struggling with big worries or anxiety, whatever we talk about it, I will tell you this so much of the time. The biggest intervention is in the people who surround them. Okay. Now, people are like, does that mean I'm the cause of this? No, we are the greatest solution. Because sometimes when we seek professional help or people to help us walk through this process, it's like, how do we gain the skill set to be able to stay regulated and calm? So number one, the parenting tips for helping children, or the big people tip for helping kids or anxiety through this process. Number one, you matter most, because anxiety is contagious. And here's the problem. When our babies, I see you, Janelle, our babies are so critically important to us, our students, our nieces and nephews, the people who we worry about the most, tend to be the ones that allow it. We want to do so well by them. And when they're struggling, or their friends are not being kind to them, or they're worried about whether they're too fat or too smart or too dumb, or, who likes them, or if they're going to die, what becomes really critical, the more distressed they become if they get into a panic and a hyperventilating situation. When we talked about that, trajectory of anxiety, a panic attack, a panic that then could potentially lead into a panic disorder, but a panic attack is a relatively common experience. When you start to get an anxious response to something, either a thought or a real situation, and then you spin even further. Oh my God, is this a heart attack? My heart is racing. I am sweating. I can't think straight. I don't know what to say. Oh my God, was that so stupid? Jesus, I'm an idiot. You start to lose your breath, which means you start to get less oxygen to your brain, which means you start to feel nauseous or dizzy. And all of those things can kind of, come in on each other. It can look very scary as a parent navigating a baby through this process. And what is also really critical then in this process is who's there to do the walking. Right? So first order of business, what I want to talk a little bit about then is how do we stay calm? Some of the most important processes that I'm going to talk about for our children is also really critical for us. You are the first order of business. Secondly, practicing reconnection skills. If I were to think about the regulating skills necessary to assist kids in getting back to the best parts of themselves, look like things like, number one, I'm going to say a relaxation from head to toe. So sometimes at bedtime, when there's really worries, and you can do this over the phone with a kid in university, you can do this, on a FaceTime if you're traveling and you have a babe that's really, struggling with things. You can lay in, sit in a chair and look at your kid. I do this with our kids all the time. Okay, so let's start with your toes, and we're going to go all the way up from your toes, and we're going to end in your head. And what we're not going to do? We're not going to let these worries kick us around right now. Okay. All of them are going to be okay. We're going to put them aside. And I don't even say that. Not all of them are going to be okay, because we don't know that to be true. We're going to set them aside for a minute, and we're going to just focus on your body. So we're going to wiggle your toes, relax them. We're going to get your ankles relaxed. I want you to think about the heels of your feet. And if I do this at bedtime, sometimes it's just a progressive relaxation of every little part of the body, because what happens is we think we're relaxed and we're not. So we do, sometimes you can make it with kids who are younger. Sometimes it can be sort of, you can think about like sand on the top of the head, or water, or a light dripping over. How do we start at the top of our head, relax our hair and our eyelashes, and your eyes are getting droopy and heavy, your cheeks and your shoulders, your fingers, and go all the way down. And sometimes, to your toes and your tummy and your knees. And if you can start at the top and go to the bottom, sometimes it's always about how do we just help you through that process. oftentimes music, I'm a huge believer in calm apps. I was having this conversation with a mom this weekend about, sometimes really even just making recommendations for our kids, particularly if they don't live in our house, about, calm apps. We always want to try to fix it. But in the moment, how we regulate the body, even at bedtime, can really help. I think there's really good hygiene around decreasing stimulation when we think about developing a routine that is maintained even as much as possible on the weekend. If you have a super sensitive kid, watching those sleep patterns, that really, I think, becomes really important to hang on to. And one of the most important things, particularly in a dysregulated state, and I talk a lot about this in kids these days too, is really this idea of offering a water or a snack. And if kids are so flipped, anxious that they've lost their words, if there is this happening, I can't even come up with words, we need to stop using our words, because if you can't produce language, you can't process it. I'll tell you that one more time. If you can't produce language, you can't process it. So if there's a lot of crying, if there is really, navigating big panics, what can be really helpful is just stopping talking and putting hands on, if it's safe enough to do it, rubbing a back, doing this, stopping the words, using just your voice, because the most significant emotional regulation for you and me happens without words. Okay. And when they can start to use their words, let me get you a drink. Can I get you a drink of water? Right? No, I don't want water. You got juice. Yep. If you got juice, get juice, whatever you got. The interesting thing is, if I can get a kid who is starting to have a panic attack or, is really in a heightened state to be able to take a drink of water, you can't chew or swallow with a flip lid. It's biologically impossible. Okay. So if we can actually do the act of drinking, the act of chewing something, and I often say this, you can't regulate a kid with a carrot stick. So, having snacks that they want, that they have access easy, a high chew. And people often ask the question about gum. Is gum helpful? If you're doing this on purpose, it's often the swallowing that becomes really important to engage the prefrontal cortex in the brain. And so sometimes that can act as a distractor, but I'm much more interested in sort of getting the regulating piece, getting eyes. And of course, being very, respectful of eye contact, because the first thing that goes when we start to feel uneasy is sort of being able to look at people. So if we can calm that body, be in the same physical presence, that is often the first step to getting regulation back on track. And then being able to use words and talk about some strategies that you might have practiced. I think also, when feelings get really big, having some tools that you can get back to, that we often sort of want to establish, not in the heat of the moment. So if you have somebody who, always before the big game loses their mind, often a bit of a mantra can help, or a calm strategy. Asher and I use this one all the time, CALM, where your job for as long as you need to is to think of every animal that starts with a C, a, an L, and an M, and you keep going through calm. Then you think about chocolate bars that start with a C, an A, an L, and an M, and you just keep picking more categories until you keep going through calm again and again and again. What happens in that process, right, is it gives the body a time to regulate. It gives the heart rate an ability to slow down, which means blood flow will increase. It also then gets the physical symptoms of the anxiety out of the body a little bit, so that then we can start to sort of notice that I might be calm again. Okay. The third thing that I will talk about is in much more of a preventative way. How does swallowing engage the prefrontal cortex? You can't do it without. So it's not an automatic response specifically. You actually need this on board from a neurophysiological perspective to make it happen. And I can engage, I can tell you that a little bit more a little bit later. The other thing that I think is really critical in this process is the creating a village. Okay, so usually as parents, we get super overwhelmed with our anxious kids and we want lots of, we want them to feel better and be better and do better. What is so important, I think, particularly if you have an anxious kid at school or on a sports team, to be able to create that village. So talking with teachers, EAs, coaches, best friends, moms about what kids needs. It's really about, if you have a 13-year-old with a really struggling with anxiety in any particular way, oftentimes you can be the sounding board. You can have conversations, but if there's that refusal, don't talk to me, I don't know, who is it in their world that can check in with them, who can wonder about what might be going on? Tell me more about this, right? Asking those questions about what's the hardest part, tell me more, really trying to figure out what might be causing some of that heightened state, or trying to identify whether it is a misinterpretation of symptoms sometimes that happens when we get in the big game, or when we're worried about, I don't know, we're training for a race or something happens. When we've had a nightmare and we don't know what's happening, nocturnal panic attacks or anxiety, oftentimes kids wake up after having a nightmare, have no memory of it, but they're in a heightened state of arousal. So sometimes people think they're having a panic attack. Putting that into context sometimes is about, do we have best friends' moms that can have conversations? Could you take her for a nice nap and have a conversation about this? Being really open to building the village, I think, becomes really, really critical in this process. Okay. So what I think is really interesting, again, I'm going to just jump into Melissa's question about creating unhealthy relationships with food. I get this question all the time. Now, here's what's interesting. When you use food as a reward, as we have done historically in the behavioral way of operating, right? You make a good choice, I reward you with a snack. You pee on the potty, you get a Smartie. That is how we get messed up relationships with food, far more than if I am using this to regulate. Okay. It is not a reward. It is a strategy within that process that says, let's get a snack. Okay. Let's talk about what's happening. Oftentimes it is when I say, we gather around food when there's big emotion, when there's a funeral, when there's a wedding, when there's a massive celebration, because you have access to the best parts of yourself. When you're consciously do that, when you're numbing, if you eat an entire an entire like bucket of ice cream, when you're, dysregulated or on the phone to something with somebody, there is a very much a connection between the food and the behavior. What I really want to talk about in using food as a strategy to assist in regulating emotion, it is really the co-occurrence of a relationship in that way that gets the body back into a place, and then we sort it out. Then we talk about the strategy. Then we go from, I know these worries are big and sometimes they push us around. The other thing that I think is most helpful in this process, that we, can kind of, I think, talk about in terms of the reconnecting, the practicing of the reconnection skills, is really this idea about externalizing anxiety sometimes as something that can push around the family in a big way, and then we can attack it as a family system, or as a duo, as a parent, as a team, as a whatever. Our son was diagnosed with a generalized anxiety disorder when he was 10, and it was interesting because lots of school refusal was happening. He was in the office all the time. I, of course, wasn't a part of the diagnostic process, but it was so interesting to listen to how debilitating the worries were sometimes, particularly at night. And we really started to externalize it as, you can identify it as anything. You could give it a name. You can call it something that's pushing you around. You can name it a swear word if that'll be helpful, if that's okay in your family system. You can call it the B word, or the, whatever you want to sort of say, like, this is the thing that is getting us. And it, gets me worried about things, and it gets me thinking about these things. And what do we do about this as a team? How can we fight it? And I think that's also very true about, at any age or stage, right? Like, what are the big worries? Is this pushing us around and we're not going to let it happen? I think it's really, sometimes it feels bigger than kids. The other thing that I think the other thing that I think I often get asked about is, when do medications become something that assist kids? Now, I, as a psychologist, cannot prescribe medications. And so this is always done in consultation with a physician who can do a great solid assessment on your child. I've often advocated for, and people in my practice, having conversations with a physician. Because sometimes when the lid is so remarkably flipped, when we're talking about significant clinical anxiety disorders, I need access to the skill, the strategies. And sometimes when there is a heightened state of arousal, when there is a lot of neurotransmitters that are keeping that lid up, that then and only then is it sort of something to consider having a conversation with your physician about. And I think sometimes it's helpful, sometimes long-term, depending on sort of the genetic component of anxiety, but much more so in the moment. I think first order of business is always to understand about emotional regulation, the strategies that help you do that, planning those strategies in a time where we're calm, not when anxiety is pushing us around. And then I think what's really critical is how do we build the resources in place to get back to the things that we know to be true, not when, but if anxiety comes into play. Okay, so I have put a few of those resources that are attached in this process, and I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions. I see that there's some amazing questions that are coming in right now, and I'm going to just go through those things really quick. But I think I'll just summarize by saying, number one, anxiety is normal and it is adaptive. It is often pushing us around the most when we are emotionally dysregulated. In fact, that is the time, that is the thing that anxiety does. It is supposed to do that. When it starts to do that and we start to misinterpret experiences, hormones come into play, uncertainty, fear, no end in sight, all of those things are indicative of us not having access to it. Our first order of business is to figure out how do we build systems in place to get that prefrontal cortex back on a little bit more often. What are those things that we can do either as a community, a team, a system, what your child or your kid can do by themselves? What is their kit to be able to do that? And I think what's really interesting to me always is, what is the cause? What are we missing? What is happening there? Are there things that I don't know about? Are there questions that I need to ask? Are there people that I need to put into place to sort of ask, are we worried about performance? Are expectations too high? Is there a genetic component to this? Is this indicative of something more critical that I should be aware of, an unhealthy relationship, a history of, being hurt in some ways? All of those things are great questions to ask. They're always, I think one of the things that Marlene Moretti taught me in the Connect parenting world is, all behavior has meaning. So what is that about? Right? And I think being able to identify that in times of distress, not demanding answers from our kids, what is wrong with you? Tell me why you're feeling this way. Because sometimes we don't have access to those things, right? Or if there's a refusal to sort of hug somebody, or they are really sort of wanting to stay close to you, sort of pushing kids into scenarios where their lid is flipped, becomes very difficult for them to sort of navigate those things. Doing the best in transition times, when we have to transition either to mom and dad or a sleepover, really doing your best to sort of maintain emotional connections to keep that lid on, transition objects. What I mean by that is, sending, a heart coin that you have and they have, so that they can stay connected when they're not with you. If there is some way to sort of keep the system regulated, little notes and lunch kits, all of those things really allow us to have access to each other, that regulating other that keeps us regulated in times of distress. I think that that's what's really critical. And then again, when we get back to what are those places to sort of help us regulate that brain again and again and again, as we start to build those skills up, I think becomes really, really critical. And if it becomes so entirely debilitating that, it's significantly or severely impairing functioning, having some conversations around some assistance with anxiety medication to be able to sort of help navigate that as we use our strategies to build in those resources so that we can stay regulated in times of distress a little bit more. Okay, so I know we have 30 minutes left. You can throw your questions in the chat. If you have any questions for me, I have a pile of them here, so I'm going to start going through them as much as I can. Robin, thank you for this question. What are your suggestions for a teen who has a learning disability in written expression? She has an IPP, who's struggling with severe anxiety. School's a trigger and having trouble getting to school. The school is aware and has made accommodations. It's a he, I think, has seen a psychologist, which he didn't like and won't go back and is against medication. Please help. Oh my goodness, mama. Okay. So I think what happens in this process again is a couple of things, right? Like normalizing, really understanding what it is to be able to, when we have really sensitive brains, when there's lots of things happening in this moment. I love that you've chatted to teachers. I've loved that you've, created accommodations in this process. What are the classes that become the most difficult to do? What can we be doing to support outside of that? And then I think sometimes what really matters in the moment is regulating the emotion, doing small pieces at one time, really externalizing some of the anxiety that I think is really, really helpful to sort of add in. And I know it's so frustrating. It is so frustrating. Who is sometimes better able to assist in this process? Sometimes it's dad or grandma or best friend that can kind of help regulate the system a little bit more to sort of get into, pieces of the day, at least one class. How do we sort of build up in that process? So that's just a few things there. What do we do for bedtime anxiety? Tina, thank you for that question. I think, again, as we sort of mentioned here, bedtime anxiety is really a common thing at all ages. And it's true for me. If I'm going to spin about a day or worry about something, it's going to happen at nighttime. I think what's really critical, again, a few of the things are, what happens in terms of routine, what happens in terms of being able to get all the worries out, being able to talk about things before. It's interesting, when we sort of regulate the system, when you work at this, in terms of putting the prefrontal cortex on first, all of the things that we kind of talked about tonight, I hope will add to this piece of also normalizing that sometimes bedtime is supposed to be dysregulating. That if we drop our shoulders and understand, we often get worked up before we get to bed, bedtime before they even do, because we know, here we go, we're going in for the fight. We start the process, right? So how can we be very clear about that and happening again and again and again? Okay, so I love this one too. My daughter is 15. She doesn't talk to me much about her anxiety. And when it comes on, it's very present. Over the last year, she's had a few times during basketball games that she encounters a physical interaction with another player that spins her into a panic attack. Recently, she walked off the court and began hyperventilating. When this happens, I give her a moment or two before approaching her. When I do, she tells me to go away. I remain calm in my approach as I want to help her, but I don't know how. And as an anxiety sufferer myself, I understand that those moments can feel out of control. It's so hard when what I want to do is help. I feel she's embarrassed and doesn't want me to comfort her. Do you have advice on how I could approach a conversation with her outside of the game? Yes. Okay. So great question about that. I think what's really critical about this is that we often, as parents, as we talked about earlier, may not be the ones to be doing the walking home through that process. I think that what's so critical is that really talking about what anxiety does, having a flip the lid conversation, having a note about, sometimes when we lose our, particularly in sporting experiences, when we flip our lid, we lose access to the best parts of ourselves, right? You might have the best shot, the best capacity to play your game, but I'll tell you what is a real bitch in sports is that when anxiety steps in, because even though we practice excessively, we lose access to it. So I don't want that to happen to you, honey. And I see in a couple of those games that this is happening. I would talk to coach. I would see if coach can come in. Is there anybody on the bench that could be helpful? Are there some skills that we could sort of talk about to kind of keep it there? The question is really sort of, why is it happening? Are we worried about failing? Do we want to be, is there somebody on the team that's kind of pissing us off? Are we worried about, part of those questions are a little bit about sort of why that's happening and then what we do about it. The business of figuring out why this is happening is often the biggest thing we miss. Okay, why is this happening? All behavior has meaning. And so I want to unpack a little bit. Is it hormones? Is it friends? Is it a combination of all those things? Is there something about the relationship on that bench that is really causing kids to sort of not feel safe or uncertain or fearful? Is there some, relationship, fear of being away from mom, being away from dad, or any of those things, things that we can address that might help us get through those things. Sandy asked, my husband died almost 6 years ago. My 11-year-old son is so afraid of something happening to me and that he is afraid to be alone. Okay, Sandy, first of all, I'm so sorry to hear about your husband. And I also want to tell you that this is a pretty normal response, right? And when there has been a significant loss in a family system, a sibling, a parent, a grandparent, particularly if there is a tragedy surrounding that, sometimes what becomes even more important is the predictability, the reassurance, the routine that happens around it, the conversations, about grief, about dad, about, the fears. And being able to then put those in specific places, right? And, how do we stay connected when we're apart? How do we stay connected to dad? And, I often talk about this in the grief work, right? Death ends a life, not a relationship. How can dad be the one that he stays connected to if that's something you believe in, that he could have conversations in his head about? How can sort of you act as a regulating other when you're not there? And I think really having a lot of grace in this situation, right? That is a pretty big, scary thing when you lose a parent as a little human, and trying as a big human. It's a scary thing. And I think just normalizing some of those conversations and understanding that, that probably isn't a conversation that will go away again, or, go away for a long time, but how do we sort of navigate through that process one step at a time? Okay. Okay, so the next one I have, Tina, I think this is a different Tina. My 15-year-old has really bad anxiety over death. Not knowing what is after death throws her into an anxious state that she curls up in a ball, wondering if what there is to live for. How can I help her? Oh my gosh. I have had the conversation about death so many times in my house. We had to get conversations with God because it's a book, and that Evan wanted to read about it. And like, is there really? Asher had the same questions. And I think that sometimes I really look at these as opportunities to engage in a conversation around what that looks like. And, what do you think? And oftentimes we try to answer the questions that there may not be an answer for. And so sometimes what's really critical in this place is to ask more questions. What do you think? Tell me about what you. Oh, did the recording stop? Oh, okay. Thanks. What I'm so interested about in this situation is really about, being able to have a conversation more so about their thoughts about it. What do you think? What are you worried about the most? It gives you more ammunition to really unpack what they're really worried about, to figure out, what are some of the things that we could, significantly talk about in the process that sort of leads us to that way. Okay. So I think that, again, normalizing that, I mean, again, at 15, there's lots of conversations that we can have about, this is a big time where things are changing in your brain, right? Worrying about the permanency of life. Am I a kid? Am I a teenager? Am I going to be an adult? All of those things happen. The human brain isn't fully developed until kids are about 25. And even then, I don't even think that's true. So there's so many things that sort of happen that become our responsibility to work through that process. Okay. And I think you're really interesting. Thank you, Tina. Jennifer says, my daughter is 7 and so anxious about school that she's refusing to go for the last month. I'm trying to force her to go. Her reactions are escalating to a near panic attack. Jennifer, thank you for this. All right. So what's really critical is a couple of things, when we are calm, what is happening at school? What are the things that we worry about the most? At 7, it's sometimes there might not be words for it. Can we draw pictures about it? Is there somebody at school? I'm sure you've done all these things, Jennifer, but I'm really interested in, having a conversation with teacher, meeting with teacher outside of the classroom or EA or principal. So many educators on this planet are amazing and overwhelmed. Is there a favorite one? Can she tell you about the librarian? Is there anybody in that system that, would even be willing to meet you on the playground or, have a conversation outside of it? Is there, any friends within the school system that allows us to be able to sort of connect to outside of school so we could look forward? Can we practice going just for an hour? Mommy will come and pick you up then. Sometimes the question is a little bit about, are they scared to leave us? Are they scared about our safety? Are we going to be okay? And some of those connections just to keep that system regulated the best of our ability. Can you pick your snacks for the morning? Sometimes those things help a little bit because, again, the underlying physiology of the anxiety doesn't tend to change, but really sort of exploring a little bit about even, if she can articulate it or draw what it might be. And if not, then I think really planning a graduated response. I hope that'll help a little bit in that process. So I'm going to go back through some of these questions now. Megan has a great question. My daughter's separation anxiety has been rearing its ugly head a lot lately. I try to always let her know Mom is just opening the front door to grab the package, or Mom is going downstairs and we'll be right back. More often than not, if I'm out of sight for more than a minute, she panics, cries out for me, has a meltdown, and tells me she's afraid I will leave and never come back, but has no answer to why she thinks that. How do I reassure her that I will just never end up just up and leave her? Great question. So part of the question I think that is really interesting is normalizing some of the conversations around, do you know that so many kids worry about, being away from moms and dads? Do you know that this is a pretty typical thing that most kids that I talk to or that I heard about or that I've read about, or you know what, my friend Stacy was telling me that this really happens all the time with her babe too. This doesn't make it any easier, I know. But I think I remember, and sometimes I often say this, I remember this happening to me too. Sometimes there's a fear that there's an abnormality to it, right? It sounds like to me that you're doing so much of, again, this sounds really like a beautiful place. I think being able to sort of do a lot of those reassurances are so interesting. And again, I think seeking out that connection to people who can do sort of an assessment around, is there something bigger going on for this babe? That's always an opportunity. That's always something that I think, let's make sure we're not missing something there. Okay. I think that, let me see. Can you touch on, so Kristen says, can you touch on littles and separation anxiety, whether it be at school, swimming, dance, etc.? Skills as parents, we can help our littles get through these times. Yes, Kristen, first of all, I think, there's so much access to great resources, and we've put some books in the resource section here, really around a little bit that is, it's the permanency, the being able to sort of stay connected when you're not there, at the end of dance, understanding, at the beginning of dance or at drop off or at school. It is the regulating of emotion, having a snack before, staying for the first couple of times, and really just normalizing the fact that those things are, pretty typical. And I think also what's so critically important is that we stay regulated through that process. I remember, so much about, hearing stories about or listening to stories about, separating at gymnastics. I remember even having twins. I have twins who are now almost 10, and, just even the difference between Olivia and Evan at, the same kid, not the same kid, the same parent, just their different styles and their interpretation of, whether they want to be a gymnastics or not. Olivia would be out bouncing. And it wasn't Evan's time. He was like, it was, very distressing for him every time. Making those decisions about, is your kid developmentally, neurophysiologically ready for some of those things, I think is really, really critically important too. And just like abandoning mission sometimes and being able to sort of regulate emotion and getting them back in a place where, we can try it again and try it again, I think is a really great thing to do. Test anxiety, Jennifer says, for a 15-year-old. Such a great question. Here's the thing. Test anxiety is normal, first of all. Let's talk about that, because it's a new situation. We're being judged in our performance. All of those things should be happening. Some of the things that I think is really critical, because of the more of the expectations we're putting on kids these days, is really about, again, some of that routine and possibility of, getting a good sleep, being able to sort of bring a snack into tests. What does our preparation look like? Any of those barriers that we can do to sort of, prepare for those days. And I think also, what's so critical about it is, to the best of our ability, normalize some of these things, right? And again, Lori, you have a great question about this. Looking for ways to support test anxiety for a university student who attends school away from home. Here's the interesting thing about technology. We often talk about the importance of, stepping in, having conversations about, engaging in some data around, what are we worried about the most? What's the hardest part, right? This is really pushing us around today. Let's kick it back, you and me today, right? What are we going to do to push this back? Let's talk about some things that we can kick it back with around. We can talk about the comm strategy, or even, if somebody's in university, how can we together do this process? How can we hook in aunt to have a chat, or, best friend's mom, or whatever that looks like. Don't forget to use your resources, that we don't have to be the only ones to sort of engage in that process. Okay. Can you touch on navigating, Tamalia asks a question. Can you touch on navigating anxiety around change? My 8-year-old suffers great anxiety around any sort of change in his routine, life, future. Oh, isn't that the truth? Particularly the more sensitive we become about things, that navigating big change around things. Again, let's normalize some of this process. I think, just like uncertainty, fear, no end in sight, all of those things that happen in this process are so much about, how do we make them as predictable as we can and do our very best not to avoid, because here's the experience about this issue, is that you can't go around it. You got to go through it. And how do we survive, even if it's little bits by little bits, to be able to sort of get some of that confidence and competence in being able to do it? You did it. Oh my gosh, right? Even if it is for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half a day, full day, what does that look like? I think that's so critical. And I'm trying to back it up here. Sorry. Good questions, you guys. Jackie, our 16-year-old is anxious about a number of things in life, but mainly about school performance. If it's not 100%, it's not good enough for her. She had to, I said to talk therapy. We will see her struggling. Her anxiety spends approximately 3 to 4 hours nightly studying. It interferes with their ability and even helps simple chores around the house. Yeah. Okay. So Jackie, I think this is fantastic. Again, I think sometimes it's like, how do we, engaging in support at school with school counselors, school therapists, having somebody somewhere, particularly in those adolescent years, to be able to sink into. What does that look like about, engaging in a family therapy chat around, what are the expectations? What is the interpretation of expectations? All of those are such a healthy thing to sort of engage with. And, I often say, and I've noticed a number of you sort of saying, my kid won't engage in therapy, won't go. I will tell you what's so critically important then. If you can't get your babe there, sometimes it's so helpful for you to do that process. to, have a consultation with a clinician or a physician, have a consultation with a therapist, go in and sort of describe your child's situation specifically, have some of those, conversations, putting into context, asking sort of what's going on in the big family system, wondering how we can sort of set up situations that might help kids. It's just sort of sometimes gives us a little bit of insight what might be going on if there's been some big changes that we haven't thought about. So that would be a thing. I see a number of questions. The interesting piece here about engaging in that process. Now, Angela, you had a really great question. Females 3 times more likely, depending on which study we look at, more likely to experience anxiety. This happens truly in adolescence much more. Here's the issue. I think we diagnose boys with ADHD at higher rates than we identify in females. And conversely, we see anxiety at higher rates. Those two symptom presentations can often mimic each other. When we think about, heightened states of arousal, irritability, loss of focus, you can see how those symptom profiles sort of overlap some things. Still to this day, females are much more emotionally like they have many more emotional words. And so we often identify anxiety as something that is experienced in teenage, adolescent women far more often than we do in males. And I think that has a lot to do with the ability to articulate emotion. I think it has a lot to do with our societal acceptance of having an emotional reaction. We still say so often these days, boys don't cry, this isn't what we do. And I think that is reflected in the data. How hard should we push young adults when they have panic or anxiety? Oh, Cheryl, good friggin' question. Such a good thing, because I think what matters so much in this process, right, is again, you can't go through it, you got to go around it. And I think not having conversations outside of the, prepping for the difficult thing, not sort of in the moment going, you got it, you like go, 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 go. But, we're going to try this. This is how we can navigate it. It is the success in some of those experiences that can really solidify our belief that we can do it. Okay. Morgan. All right. So you are doing so much. Beautiful questions here. I'd love to see in the chat anything that's going to stick out for you. We have 3 more minutes tonight. And I hope so many of these questions have been answered in, some of these situations, really around some of the resources that we've attached to following up with a local therapist, physician, if you are concerned about some of the symptom presentations, getting support for the big people first and the little people second is always my recommendation, because that's really, I think, how we navigate things. And so one more question, Megan. There's 2 questions she thought were the same. Panic, anxiety, and puberty in a 12-year-old. My daughter has generalized anxiety rooted in being afraid to vomit. Now we have puberty and an even bigger emotions. I try not to lose patience, but it's so hard sometimes. Oh my goodness. Okay. So first of all, parents, what I want to do is give you, lastly here, just sort of grace in this process. Of course, we get emotionally dysregulated. So here's how we're going to end tonight. I want us to drop your shoulders. Okay. Take a deep breath. Wiggle your toes. Relax your jaw. Smile. Let your gut out. That's a relaxed body. You can take your babes through that process too. Start to really understand that so much about anxiety is that it puts us in a heightened state where we worry about things that often have no ability to hurt us in that moment. Couldn't they come to fruition? Are there big things that could happen in this world? Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. All of those things are true. But also, you are some of the most important people in the lives of your children. Or if you're an educator, you become some of the most important people in this walking process. Build in your village, grab your people around you, consult when we need significant support in this way. And mostly, I hope that we've provided you with enough resources tonight to be able to navigate through some of these big things. Again, you can, you know, I think your local resources, if you need some assistance with local resources, reach out to us. You can send us an email. And it was just such an honor to sit with you tonight. The resources are here. I know if you've had any difficulty, we have a 48-hour watch that will start now. Is that right? Start now. So you have 48 hours to access the link. And I hope that, you know, that you'll take away some really great things from tonight. I thank you for loving Kids These Days and the course that went along with it. There's always more resources that we have. You know, I think Kids These Days is a pretty good friggin' book. I think Teachers These Days is a pretty good book. I've listed some other books in there that we really love. Also, you know, Kids These Days, the course also talks at much more length about emotional regulation, but you know, none of those things are important. You know, as I hope you've taken some things away from tonight, because it was just such an honor to sit with you. Dale, is there anything else you want to add? No, we got everything. Things seem to go fairly well. Okay. Okay. She said just pause before I press it. Okay, very good. Thank you for being here, Megan, Tara. Thank you for all of those comments and those messages. I just love it. I love that you were here. I love that we had people. We had, I think, over 700 people sign up for this course tonight, and it just is, it is such an honor. My hope is that in this workshop series, we can provide some education around this place of mental health that I think we are just struggling with so much. We are in such a heightened state these days as a globe. And so I'm so grateful you were here. And if you showed up for your kids tonight, either the ones you love or you lead or you serve, I just want to tell you, I think you're amazing. Drop those shoulders, go lean into each other, and have a fantastic night. Good night, everybody.